primarily death is pretty much hidden away. And for people in more agricultural, in earlier times, not only in the United States, but all over the world, death was simply a part of life. You did not, kind of pack up Granny and send her to the nursing home. Granny stayed there until she died, and the family were the caretakers for people. And when a person died, then it was the family that washed the body, put the clothes on the body, prepared for burial, and then many times would bury that person themselves. So that this became kind of it was a cultural norm. Children saw this, children were aware of it, they were around it during the whole time that all this was going on. Nobody was surprised by any of these things. And so when somebody got sick, everybody knew the thing that had to happen. They would go get a doctor if they could do something for that person. But primarily, if it appeared that this really was some kind of fatal illness, then the family would simply prepare for that day for it to happen. And they would take care of that person within the home. And so it became a very personal experience, very much one-on-one kind of experience. Unlike today, where we tend to shuffle people off to an institution or a nursing home or something of the sort. We may see them every once in a while, not very often, most times. We'll see them occasionally. And by seeing them occasionally, we will happen to have this disconnectedness, if you will. The person is getting sicker. We may recognize the person, or it may be so long that we don't really recognize the person. They may not recognize us. But it's still this process, but it's kind of hidden away. It's something that is not a part of our everyday life. Yet what we can find out and what we can determine is that it is beneficial for us to be aware, not only just aware of death, to be aware of people that we love and how they are dying and where they are and what they are thinking and what they are feeling and how they are reacting to this thing that's happening in their life. So we are missing some of this, and at the same time we're missing, if you will, kind of our own training in this, because we will die. That's the one thing everybody knows about. It's a lot more certain than taxes even. We're going to die. It may be soon, it may be a long time from now, it may be a time where we're within our right mind and can fully understand what's going on. We may be not in our mind at all. And there's any number of ways, but it will happen to us. And it will happen to us someday. But we don't like to think about that. We like to think about putting it off. And so in the church, in any church that calls itself Christian, there is kind of this expectation that there's going to be something better. But there's a gap between how we get there, how we deal with our illness, or however it is that we're going to die, and what we expect once we get past that, and what we're going to have. And so we have this gap, this terrible problem with people where what is really happening is that we don't really know what to say or what to do. And because we don't know these things, because we're unable to deal with these, it can, number one, it can change the experience of the person that we love that's dying. Because that person, in many ways, as we're going to see as we read this book, takes cues, if you will, from the people that love that person, the family, the caregivers, all of these people. And so we have this problem. And so we don't have that full recognition of what's going on. But at the same time, it dilutes our ability to think about death, our own death, and how we deal with that and how our families are going to deal with us. So there's this huge disconnect. We know about death. We expect certain things out of it, but we've lost that intimacy that people have had with death over the centuries, when it's simply a part of everyday life. Well, so culturally, that has been a real problem. That's been a real shift in the way that things have happened as societies become maybe increasingly industrialized, or different things have happened. Nobody dies at home anymore, or hardly anybody does. Some people do, but it's not the norm. It's not the thing that's going to happen. And so, whereas at one time the person would die and the family would clean up the person and the people from the neighborhood would come and pay their respects to that person in their home or in the person's home, it was all a very family kind of thing. And then they would take the body to the church, I guess, and there would be a funeral service, and then they would be put into the cemetery. Everybody was a part of every part of that. The children were a part of it. The adults were a part of it. Everybody was aware of what was happening. The same thing was true in Orthodox cultures, in the same kind of way. And in fact, it became, for Orthodox cultures, it was, if anything, perhaps more intensely personal. You know, there's a rule, of course, within the Orthodox Church that, all other things being considered, that a person will not be embalmed, that a person will simply be brought to the church, laid out in the church, and from there, that is when, ideally, the liturgy will be served around them, and then the funeral will be served over them, and then they'll be taken and buried in a similar kind of way. But in a sense, the Orthodox way of doing this becomes more of a community thing. If somebody dies, then everybody in the church is going to know, and everybody in the church will be a part of it. Traditionally, when a person lies in the church in the coffin, and ordinarily the coffin is open, for a lay person, the Psalms are read over that person. And ideally, they'll be read over that person until the time for the funeral and the time when they are taken to the church or to the graveyard. In the same way, if a bishop dies, for example, like Metropolitan Nicholas, and the church stays open, and people that want to stay there all night. And I know with Metropolitan Nicholas, the priests were taking turns going and reading the Gospels over the body all through that night, with the funeral being the next morning. And so there's this personal thing. There's this personal aspect to it that everybody, those living and the person that died, is a part of this situation. It's a part of this process. And everybody has a role to play. One person has to prepare him or herself for death and then die. And that's more than we think. I mean, we just think, well, they're going to die. What do they need to do? But they need to do a lot. There's a lot that happens with a person during that period of time. And so and then the people that are in the church that are still living, we have a responsibility to see that person off in an appropriate way. You know, back in 2005, I was in San Francisco, and I went one Tuesday morning, it was the middle of the week, I remember, and I walked into the cathedral. And what surprised me was the fact that there were a lot of people there. It wasn't a feast day, it wasn't anything particular, but they were serving liturgy. And in front of the royal doors, which were open, and the priest is serving liturgy, and there's deacons and all the usual stuff, there are two coffins, and they're both open. And they both had elderly Oriental ladies, one in each coffin. And so they were serving the liturgy around the bodies. And then whenever they would come out for censing, they would cense the bodies. I was standing next to a man, and he kind of leaned over and he said, "Those are the last two of St. John's orphans, the ones that he brought from China and brought across the Pacific Ocean. That was the end of them. That was the last two still living." And they were both being buried that morning. And a lot of people were there. I mean, not just the clergy, but it was the church wasn't completely packed, but there was a reasonable number of people there for the liturgy and for the funeral that was going to follow after. And so when we think about these things, when we think about ourselves as being the person that is dying, or we think about ourselves as being the person or the people that are responsible for shepherding that person, if you will, for caring for that person, to helping that person to prepare for their own death, then this becomes something that is a very important aspect of it. And it's very important from the other point of view, which is that we ourselves, if we are going to die a Christian death, need to prepare ourselves to die a Christian death. What we say in this book, if you started reading it, we have a number of different examples of this. And in the first chapter, which is really what I want to talk about today, we see some ways in which people do prepare or don't prepare, if you will, for the idea of death. And all of these are pretty important because I think for all of us, when we read this, we can kind of see ourselves, the people that aren't prepared, because of the things that they're doing, or in their relatives that aren't prepared at all. I think we see that with people. I mean, how many times do you go and see somebody that is frankly own his or her way to death, and people are going, "Oh, it's going to be okay. They're going to get this. They're going to get this fixed. You're going to be okay." And it's the people that are in the room, the ones that are living still, the ones that are still healthy, who are telling this other person who probably knows perfectly well that that's foolishness and that they're going to die. It's not helpful then for people to be talking to them about this. So in chapter 1, the introduction, of course, is kind of where I kind of got the notion about what I was talking about there. But in chapter 1, we run into this, she's the author, Frederica de Graaf, is a spiritual child of the late Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, who was the Metropolitan in England for a number of years. He's passed away now, but he's well thought of. And in fact, I think Father Deacon taught a class on him, a book that he had written called Beginning to Pray, if I recollect, and a number of people came for that. He really is as a modern, he's not a saint, but as a person in the modern times, it's looked at with a lot of respect. Certainly Metropolitan Anthony is one of those people. And so we start out with asking some questions about suffering, because in a lot of ways, our attitude toward death is going to be really dictated by our attitude towards suffering. And not just, that includes our own suffering, which is we're already at a disadvantage there, because, of course, in modern times, we don't want to suffer. And I mean, who does, right? Nobody goes out looking for that stuff. But we also kind of pretend like it's not there. That suffering isn't going to happen to us. It happens to other people, but it's never going to happen to me. I'm healthy, I'm doing good, everything's fine. And so we have this disconnect. We have this disconnect between suffering and death and virtue and heaven and hell, living and dying. And so we start with this idea about suffering. Is suffering an evil? Is it always an evil? Well, if you think about it, we're taught to consciously avoid suffering. Nobody wants to suffer. And so we arrange our lives so that we don't suffer. We develop big government programs so that other people don't suffer. But these are kind of band-aids, because suffering is going to happen. It's going to happen to everybody at one time or another. But so when it comes to us, when it comes and knocks on our door, or it comes and knocks on the door of somebody we love, then how are we supposed to look at it? We think back to the story of Job in the Old Testament. Job suffered like nobody's business. I mean, Job was put in that position, not through his own fault, but kind of between the devil and God. Because the devil said, he will curse you, you just watch that. And God's like, no, he's not going to. And so they have this thing, and Job loses everything. Children, house, property, riches, wealth, his wife. But before she dies, his wife says, you should just curse God. Remember, if you've read that book, and it's well worth reading, a lot of it has to do with the conversation between Job and his wife, and then Job and these three friends who come over to kind of, buck him up, right? They're going to give him some encouragement of some kind or another. But basically, they're all negative. And so he's being told essentially, well, you should curse God. God hasn't done you any favors, and you should curse God. Well, what we know is that God himself certainly blessed Job afterwards. He gave him a new family, and new children, and new wealth. And we look at that and we go, well, that's good, but it doesn't have that satisfying ending that sometimes we're looking for. But we also look at other examples of suffering throughout the scripture, both Old and New Testament. What about Lazarus, who sat on the doorstep of the rich man's house, and who had nothing and was given nothing, and just was lying there in his illness and in his sores. We talk about the sores and the dogs licking his sores. And what we know, or what we understand, I think, is that the rich man was not consciously evil. He was not one of these people that were saying, what can I do to bedevil Lazarus today? Instead, he was like, Lazarus? Who's Lazarus? He simply had no conception who Lazarus was. Here's this man lying by his porch, and he's like, he may as well not be there. He's not seen. He's not a part of what the rich man has to deal with every day. And so he doesn't really think much about it. He doesn't think about the thing at all. If we talk about that Lazarus' suffering, as bad as it was, led to something far greater for him, his patience and his willingness to continue to trust in God. So his suffering was certainly a bad thing on a day-to-day or minute-to-minute basis. Lazarus did not have an easy life. But at the end of the day, his suffering became something much better than that. In the same way, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we see this man who's set upon on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and he's just beaten terribly. And it's another man, a man who nobody has any respect for, a Samaritan who's unclean anyway, who picks him up and takes him down the hill to the hotel or to the inn and arranges for him to be kept. It is this man's suffering that puts him in that good place. If he'd just been walking on the way to Jericho, Samaritan doubtless would not have noticed him at all. Now, all this makes you go, that's really, really hard. It's almost like suffering in a masochistic sense. But the truth is, we're all going to have that suffering. Very few people just keel right over it, like right that moment. If you have a lingering illness, it's going to be there. It's going to linger. If you have one of these illnesses that takes everything from you but leaves you alive in a husk, then that's going to happen. And how we deal with that will determine what we have to say and how we get by. Now, there's some really good examples in chapter 1 that I'm sure everybody read about, but were really meaningful if we take these things and we say, okay, how do we know how suffering is? And so the first one is, the question is suffering always evil? And the first example that the author, that Mr. Graff writes, has to do with a little 5-year-old boy and his mother, Irina. So with a 5-year-old boy, he's terminal. Everybody we're going to read about in this book is terminal. And we're all terminal already, if you take a look at it that way. Johnny was really ill. And whatever his illness was, it was difficult on him. And he was, I think, lying in what apparently was a coma, or at least non-responsive, for a long time. And then one day, his mother, who's always there with him, his mother realizes that his eyes have opened, and he started talking to somebody kind of up on the ceiling. And she can't really make any sense out of what it was. But Johnny is thrilled. Johnny is absolutely happy, you can tell, to be talking to whoever it was he was talking to. And so he talks to that person for a half hour or so, we're told, and then kind of collapses again. Well, his mother, who saw this only as suffering, had to come to grips with, what if this means something more? What if the suffering that my son has is something that may lead to something greater for him, for the boy? And so she prays the next day, and the nurse overhears her. And she prays, and she says, and she basically is telling Johnny, in other words, she's saying, if you were speaking with God, if you were with God, if that is who you were talking to yesterday, then you should go. It's a really hard thing to say, actually. I think that we, people do say that sometimes. Sometimes in my own family, this was what my sister and I went to California when my father was dying. And he'd been in the same kind of shape for a long time. And we went, we were in the room, and he was, at the very first, he could kind of move a finger. That was about all he could do. And then he was non-responsive otherwise. And finally, we're ready to leave. And we just said, Daddy, if you're ready, go ahead. And he died soon after that. Sometimes it is best. People suffer because it's, in a way, is kind of a way of purifying their experience or their themselves. And sometimes they suffer because the family, wants them to hang in there and never stop. And so we have all of these different things. Now there's a second example about a young woman named Anna, who I think had breast cancer, if I remember correctly. And she was not at all, if you will, religious. I mean, she was Muslim, but she wasn't even religious Muslim. She was a person who, it appears, my reading of it, appeared that she simply didn't care much about religion. I mean, before she got ill. And then she got ill, and it kind of caused her to have to do some things, to have to talk about herself. And she actually, in a sense, had to seek out that new self within her, to put that old self aside and become a new person. And then she was ready to die. There's another example of that that's not in this book, but has always been really striking. There's a monk, he's from Cyprus, but he's in England, Archimandrite Zacharias. He was the spiritual son of Elder Sophrony, who is now Saint Sophrony, who in turn was the spiritual son of Saint Silouan of Mount Athos. It's kind of a family tree here. Well, at a talk that I heard Archimandrite Zacharias give, he talked about how a woman once came to him for confession. And so they started talking, and she just broke down, and she said, "This is terrible. I've been told I have 3 months to live, and that's all. How am I going to do this? What am I supposed to do?" And so Zacharias says what she was not expecting. He goes, "This is wonderful news. This is the best thing you could ever hear." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You have time to prepare. And he said, "I'll tell you how." And so he taught her the Jesus prayer. He taught her about how this was preparing her to go to a much better place, to become a much better person, to be a person that would actually meet God. And so he sees her another couple of times, maybe about once a month. And then he gets word that she's in a hospital in London and she's dying. So he goes to the hospital room. And she's like kind of curled up in bed. She has her prayer robe. And when she sees that he's there, she smiles. She goes, "I'm ready." And she was. This was not a person who necessarily was ready 3 months before. But her suffering had allowed her to reach this point and to become the person that Zacharias hoped that she would become. Now, it takes courage to do that, to be honest. We see a lot of people, and in the next section, there are a lot of different examples. Some people just cannot believe that they have to die, and they're not going to accept it. But that's not a good way to look at it. I mean, it's fine to fight death if you want to, but death will always win sooner or later. And so anyway, we have how we approach death is going to be good. But then we ask, all right, if suffering isn't always bad, and we just had these stories having to do with where suffering really was a good thing for this person, then what about death? Is death an evil? Is it always evil? And the answer is absolutely not. And again, there's Metropolitan Anthony who writes this in that regard. He says this: "Our days are not what they seem to be. Time is illusory. If we say that we should remember death, this does not mean that we should fear life. This is said so that we should live with all of our intensity, all our might, as we would if we were aware that each moment is a unique one for us. Each moment of our life should be perfect, not only at the receding of the wave, but at its crest. It should not be defeat, but victory. However, when I speak of defeat and victory, I do not have in mind either outward success or its absence." And then this is meaningful, I think. "I have in mind an inner becoming, an inner growth, the ability to be at each given moment all that one is in all of his or her fullness." What does that mean? Well, if we look at the story from Zacharias, from Archimandrite Zacharias, we know that this woman's ability to be meant that she changed over those last 3 months. Our former parishioner who has gone on to the Lord, Katina, she changed when she decided that she was going to not go to all the doctors. I mean, she flew all over the country to doctors. If anybody gave it a good try, she did. And then she understood finally, she just had to give up. Like I said, the last weeks of her life were spent in quite the same way as some of these other stories we're talking about. So that her death became one of beauty, became something that would inspire everybody that was in the room when that death came around. That is why it's not evil, it's a transition. It's a transition from this life where we have responsibilities and jobs and all the things we have to do into a life that we don't really have a good feel for yet, but that we are assured it's a very good one. So we have this, and Mr. Graff talks about in this context the 3 kinds of attitudes towards death, 3 types. The first one, she says, is call it the pure atheist, the person who does not believe in God at all and isn't worried about anything. And then she makes a note, and I think this is true, that these people are exceedingly rare. Atheists, as the moment comes, tend to seize up a little bit, more than a little bit, and become overcome by fear, is my experience with that. I don't know that I've ever run into anybody that could actually hold on to that sense of not being afraid of what's going to happen next, all the way through the process of dying. So they don't exhibit fear initially, but as time goes on, they certainly do begin to know fear. All of a sudden they doubt themselves and they doubt their beliefs. The second is what apparently Metropolitan Anthony called a quarter of belief. This is somebody that says they believe, and they kind of believe, and they'll tell you that you believe. They may even go to church, probably go to church, but they lead the most of their life without any real consideration for what they're being told or taught in church. In other words, they can come here, they can do whatever, the things that what everybody else does. They might receive communion, they might come to confession every once in a while. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really mean anything, because as soon as they get out the door, they're going to go back to what they do or have been doing or want to do, whatever that may be. And so we have these people, they're baptized probably, but they're not entirely committed. Their belief is simply a belief. There's no real foundation to that belief. And so these people are just kind of out there. And they may think that they're in great shape, they're ready to die, they may know all the things that we want to think, but without any kind of particular foundation for that belief, which obviously has real problems. And so we have, and in this regard, there are 2 examples that the author deals with that I think are, helpful in the sense of giving us some idea of what to avoid. The first one has to do with the person that he called Lydia, who was a woman who she was in the hospice, and her most frequent visitor was her sister. But Lydia was not prepared to die and fought it, and cried bitterly. It was the kind of person that would say, "This isn't fair. This can't happen to me. How can this happen? This is terrible." Just on and on. This was a constant theme. And her sister would come and try to offer consolation, try to offer help, and she just blew her off. And so what Mr. Graff talks about is, well, how did that leave the sister? Once Lydia dies, what's the sister supposed to believe? Has this affected the way in which her sister will approach her own death? She thinks, well, my big sister thought it's hopeless, that this is just punishment, this is just hell on earth. Would that affect, and you could see that it would, the sister's ability to be courageous and to seek her own way in death, to seek that awareness that we've seen in some other people. The second person had to do with with a person named Peter. Now, Peter was apparently a young man, and he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he was essentially left alone by his family. And his family, they might come some to him, but when they came, they just, I don't know, talk about soccer or, whatever. They wouldn't talk about what was going on with him. They wouldn't talk to him about anything serious. They wouldn't talk to him. And we see this a lot. I've seen this in my family. Somebody's dying, and you go, and somebody is going to say, "Oh, you're going to be fine. They're going to get a medicine. You're going to be up. I'll see you at home next week." I mean, that kind of business, which is just foolish, in which the person that's laying in bed knows it's foolish. Because I think the one thing that we can agree on, and certainly what is being taught in this book, is that if you're going to die, you know you're going to die. You just know. And I don't know how, and I don't know how soon before, but there reaches a point where people who are terminal just kind of come to grips with it, and they know this is what's going to happen to them. So we have this thing where this young boy, this young man, was kind of left on his own because his family just didn't want to address it. Didn't want to do anything with him. They just wanted to pretend like it wasn't there. They didn't really, ask him to talk about his suffering. They didn't ask him to say anything about how he felt or what they could do from an emotional point of view. What support could they give them? And so he really was on his own. He was on his own in his own dying. And he was, if I remember right, he was 19 years old. He was a really young person. 19-year-olds don't have any real capacity, I think, to come to grips with some of this stuff in any kind of really good way. And so, but then the only time his mother, who was the one that came to see him, actually showed some awareness as to what was going on with Peter, says Mr. Graff, was when he died. And then when she realized he was dead, she started screaming and all of these things. And this became something that was not a help to the boy. It was not a help to her. And if we have this, then we will damage the person who is dying. But just as importantly, we'll damage ourselves. If that is the way we are taught, or we believe we need to react to death or suffering, then that is simply not one that's going to be at all good. Well, finally, the last kind of, if you will, part about this, the one that's really can give you some hope, is the one about Michael on page 10. If you remember, Michael was 22 years old. He had a wife, and they had really dreamed about having a baby, and that had never happened. The wife was always there. Michael was always really upbeat. And he knew, and he told his wife that he would be there to watch after her after she died. And they would say, "Well, how do you know that?" And he'd say, "Because I know the scripture. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living." And so he kept telling his wife this would be it. And because I kind of love this little part, because they didn't have a baby, they got a kitten. And the kitten lived in the bed with him, and then I guess went home after he passed away. For that kind of warmth, it's not a baby, but it's not a bad substitute either in the big scheme of things. His wife was in the same way. His wife was of the same mind. She was very dignified. She was there for her husband. She would talk to him. She would just be there. And sometimes just being becomes a very important thing to do. And they were very much in love with each other. Because they could face this together. And so for the author, the story of Michael becomes the story of a success, if you will, of an ideal way in which a family meets death, the death of one of those people. And so what people have to do then, by looking at all these stories, is that they need to recognize that death is not a punishment. I mean, we die because of the original sin. We die because when Adam and Eve did their thing, death entered the world, and it's still hanging around. And it will, I guess, as far as I know, until something greater happens. But it's not like a punishment. for individuals. It's something that happens. And so that's the beginning of coming to grips with death, is to understand that we have this thing coming down the road at us, but it's not the end. It's a transition from one place to another place. She tells a story about her own sister who had to die. And she wanted to go to see her spiritual father, I guess, who was living in another country. And so she and a friend, she was well enough to travel to go and see this person. And on the phone later on, she said this. She said, you know, when you stand in front of death, everything changes. This kind of, in my mind, kind of ties up something else, which is mentioned all through this part we talked about. And that is that you cannot live. You cannot fully live until you fully internalize death. You know, we live without thought of death because we don't want to think about death. And so we make our plans in this particular way. But if we are courageous and we live knowing that death will come to us, and we are courageous, then we can go ahead and we can live and we can help other people that are suffering. We can do all the things. We can follow the Gospels and we can be courageous. And then when death comes for us, prepared for it. And that becomes something that is absolutely critical. It's just so important. We don't want to talk about death. Nobody wants to talk about death. But we best, if nothing else, for our own sakes, not to mention those around us. If I was told to die, I hope what I would do is to I might say, well, how long? And hopefully, they might say something, and then like Zacharias, I'll go, 3 months. Cool. This is going to be great. And then simply kind of fall back into silence with my wife and prepare myself for it. Death isn't it's not a punishment. And that's how we see it. It's not a punishment. It's what everybody has to face. But how we face it can make all the difference in the world about how we live afterwards. Okay, that's kind of what I had tonight. What I have in mind is that if anybody has questions, or if anybody in their own life has some kind of examples or stories that kind of fall into the same things we're talking about, I'd be really, really happy to hear that. I think that way we can give each other some examples of good things and bad things. It's good to know about both, actually. So, anybody have any thoughts or questions as far as that goes?
Of course, I have something.
Okay.
Of course. Well, we live in a culture that is in absolute denial that death exists.
Yeah.
I was listening to a talk from Father Thomas Hopko, and he said a friend of his, he was familiar with many of the undertakers in town as a priest.
Yeah.
And he says one of them called him, and he was thoroughly shaken, and Father said to him, well, what's the matter? He says, I've never had this happen before. I had a man call me up and say to me, my mother has died, she's in this hospital, go get her, and when you processed her body, let me know, I'll come pick it up. Yeah. But whereas even 100 years ago, people, if you made it to 20, you'd already seen one of your parents die, a couple of your brothers and sisters. We don't see death. No. And it's so easy to be in denial of it. And I think there's also this balancing act, because if you're given a diagnosis that is presumed to be terminal, people like if I was given such a diagnosis, yeah. John would know. I don't know if how I would tell you. Maybe you, Father, but yeah. People look at you and like, how are you? Like you're already in the coffin. Okay? Yeah. And that is not helpful. It doesn't help you prepare for death, and it certainly makes you feel like they want you to die, hurry up, so that I have to keep dealing with you. Mm-hmm. And so I just, and I make those 2 comments because I'm very thankful that this is our adult study, and I really think that I'm very thankful that you're just going to let it play out as long as it takes, because it's something that, as Americans especially, where denial is a river of Egypt and we're all flowing down it, we really you really need to be able to believe that God is the God of the living.
It really is true. I mean, and we see that in so many ways. We see, beauty's for the young, right? I mean, once you hit 30, forget about it. You lose a lot of your appeal. As people get older people, once people get really old, they're like looked at in many ways as being like, well, what's that person doing hanging around?
Useless leaders.
Yeah. So it is. It covers a lot of cultural corners that really need to have some light shed on, I think. And so this, I think, is a good part of this. And hopefully we'll come out of this thing. Not like, I want to go die, but we'll come out of it. In fact, well, after you listen to me, people want to say that. But that we'll come out of it and we'll say, I think I could be ready now. I think I know how to get ready for this now. And that's really important. Okay. Anybody else?
Just I thought about death is something like it's punishment for some people, for most people. Mm-hmm. But the actual thing, I believe, punishment is when person dies without suffering. This is kind of punishment, right?
Well, I think so.
It's no time to repent.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. We saw that in one or two of these stories tonight that people weren't really sure they were dying, but they were trying to figure out what they were supposed to do, but they came to grips with it. And they figured this out before they died, and which is really important. Later on down the road we'll see where, a lot of times dying becomes a fearful thing for religious people because we're afraid of where we go. What's going to happen to us? And so, that's another thing that I want to talk about later on down the road. That's several weeks down the road. But I will tell you that if you look online, you'll find this speech that was given at a youth seminar, apparently very patient youth, I guess. It's called The River of Fire. And it has to do with the way in which God is perceived, and that perception becomes the difference between whether we are, with God in love, or whether we are just tortured by the presence of God. It's a very interesting kind of thing. It's really hard on Western theology, so be prepared. But but we'll get to that later. That's not down the road. Yeah.
I was just gonna say I have the booklet of that talk. I actually read the whole thing, and it is very interesting. It's so different from, I think what most of us are raised thinking about in terms of that. But I think one of the things that struck me, and this I think has to do with what you just said, is the lady who had breast cancer and was struggling to come to terms with her illness, and she had sort of lived a life not interested in God. The one that was a Muslim and didn't, she just wanted to make money and all that.
Yeah.
But she said, I slowly began to understand that God loves me, and that understanding of a loving God helped her to change completely into a different person. And I guess I would say that maybe I think Orthodoxy offers such an idea, or not an idea, but the reality of a loving God. We say it in every liturgy, you are a God that loves mankind. And I think that knowledge helps us prepare too, because we know that God is love.
Yeah. And I think I read that part of that story that young lady was talking about. When I read that, and I kind of think this might be true, that sometimes people will go into a terminal situation and go, no, you got whatever, so much time to live. And they may rebel against that at first. But that the longer they live, it's almost like losing baggage, kind of. It's like they start to have realizations. The more that they suffer, the more that they come to understand that they really are heading towards the end of all things, that at the same time allows them to see things that didn't have the capacity to see before. If their only capacity was to see making money or having another career, whatever it happened to be, then all of that's falling away. All of that is like just dropping off the cart or out of your pocket because it's not of any significance to you. And maybe, I think oftentimes that's when, God's always been there, always talking, but it's only then when they start losing this other baggage that they can start hearing and start understanding a little bit about Him.
One of the themes that is woven through the Old Testament is, and the New, but is this deep awareness of the transience of life.
Mm-hmm.
All flesh is grass, all its loveliness is the flower of the field, and I think that's in our modern contemporary culture, that's a consciousness that's been lost, and there's a great resistance to aging, and it's kind of like connected with death, so Botox and plastic surgery and all of this.
I may be 60, but I'll look 25.
Yeah, it's just this delusional kind of, but that awareness that, David in Psalm 39, he said, he prays, God, teach me to know my end and how transient I am. It's like where that is this prayer to have this kind of consciousness, and it's like the author says, or Metropolitan Anthony, it says, when that's deep in us, then we can live with courage and fullness, because each day is a gift. Each day is maybe we could see it as a talent that the Lord has given us to be invested in some, for the kingdom. But without that, that sense of awareness of, and I think that's how, when I read the genealogy of the scriptures, that's what strikes me, is that each person is like this symbol of an entire generation. No matter what your wealth, no matter what your prowess physically, no matter what your beauty, your intellect, everybody symbolized in that one name is gone. And so when you read the genealogy of Christ, and you just read this, and it's like, that generation is gone.
Yeah.
The next generation is gone. And it's that sense of transience, and yet promise, because like in the genealogy of Christ, it was going somewhere. It wasn't just an end. It was a chain in this movement of God in history.
And again, I think that's really important. We look back at our own lives, we look at the work we did, and we might think, I was really good at that. Well, you're not anymore. I'm not. I'm not. I mean, you. I'm not. And I know that. That's behind me. And something else, and then there'll come a time when I look back at that and I go, well, not anymore. We go through these stages. It's not that we're being punished. Our lives just go on, and everybody does. So we just need to have that proper perspective on that. And I think that's really important. Nancy, you're in a little corner of the screen over there. Did you have anything to say?
I'm enjoying it.
Okay, well, you won't later, I'm sure. Okay, all right, George?
Oh, just a personal reflection and experience. When I was going through formation for the permanent diaconate, the Roman Church, for 2 years, I had a ministry where I went to one nursing home every Friday afternoon. And I would go and I would take communion to the Catholics there. And I did this for 2 years but sometimes twice a week, but for 2 years without interruption. And what I learned from that was that I didn't know all the people who were there personally, but I knew their relatives and who they were related to in town. Pensacola was still a fairly small town at the time, about 150,000, but you knew the names. And these were people who had lived in the town for a long time. And when I would talk to the nurses who supervised what went on, I asked, I said, how often do these people get visits? Because I've yet to see a visitor there. And she said, well, there's really only one patient here who ever has a visitor. And that was this old retired admiral. His wife was always there with him. And I started to name, I said, well, what about Mrs. Bagley? I said, I know her daughter. I went to high school with her daughter. She doesn't come to see her mother. No, never. Has never been here. And I said, well, all these others? No, nobody. Nobody ever comes. And it's not, I think, because they didn't love their mother or grandmother or grandfather, father, whatever the relationship was. I think they just didn't want to be around the idea of death, because death is every day, almost in a nursing home. I mean, I had a congregation of about 20 people that it was first just the Catholics, and then others started coming, and it was a new congregation about every 2 months. And I would ask the nurses, what happened to this person? Well, he died, she died. So always had turnover. But it seems like, there was always a replacement. So
Always a replacement.
No way is
We're on our way.
I could get the same talk almost every week. And they would always be the first time, because most of them had forgotten it, and, then they would die, and of course, somebody new would take their place. But it was a variety of people, I said, but nobody ever came to see them. And that was so hard for me to accept. Because both my mother and grandmother died in nursing homes, and I always went to see them. It was just to me unconscionable that you could leave a parent there. And rather than be judgmental of the people, so I started asking, why can't they face their mother, father, grandfather?
I think it is a fear reaction. I think people, they know they're going there. And some bed has a name, there's a bed with their name on it, and they don't really want to come to grips with it.
But I don't want to have kids like this who don't want to visit me.
Yeah.
It's horrible. Yeah. I don't believe it's about fear of death. It's just a careless, no love there. Yeah. This is main answer. Yeah. I'm sure about that. It's not about fear of death. We're all afraid of death. The question is, do you have any practical advice? What kind of prayer maybe we have to distract ourselves from the fear of death, or someone is dying, and kind of what we need. Like when I'm in dentist office, I'm praying, "Our Father who art in heaven," over and over and over. And suddenly the dentist says, "It's over." Oh God, thank you.
You survived.
Do we have something like this when you're dying?
Well, let me look. But I think a lot of prayers, don't mention death specifically, but they do talk about living that day. Like the morning prayer, Metropolitan Philaret, I think, and then there's an evening prayer. And the evening prayer of his is much different. I mean, the morning prayer is all like, help me to do the right thing. Don't let me, offend others. And the evening prayer is, I ask neither a cross or consolation. I leave it to your will as to as to what happens. It's a much, in the morning it's like, he's okay, I'm gonna get started. And in the evening, he's like, I don't even know what I did, but your will be done, I think it's the long and short of it.
When Anthony Bloom was a doctor and a priest in World War II, and he was working in a hospital in Paris, and he had German soldiers and French people, and the other doctors would be like, this one's gonna die, just leave him alone, just, spend your time and energy with someone else. But he would like, oh no. And he would make sure that he would tend to that person, and he would stay the night with them. He would stay with them until they died. And he said one soldier, he said, was like in a coma. He sort of just came a little bit into consciousness in the morning, a German soldier, and he said to Metropolitan Anthony, he wasn't Metropolitan then, but he said, I knew you were here. Thank you. And it struck me, it really struck me that he always had that compassion for people who were dying. And then he said, in the book, he's like, in the talk, you don't leave the dying alone. It's like, is there such a thing as an unforgivable sin? Is that the sin against the Holy Spirit? I don't know, but it was real close.
It's funny you mentioned that. Once he got all of his refugees and all the people following him across the Pacific into San Francisco, later St. John, but John Maximovich was named as bishop in Paris. And so he was in Paris, and he became well known among the Parisians for haunting the hospitals in the middle of the night. He'd just go up and down the hall. He'd see everybody. He'd talk to Jews, he'd go in and pray with Jews and Muslims and everybody. And they all knew him, although a lot of people couldn't figure out who he was. And so he was, that was kind of his way of doing all of that business. And it's, the French really loved it. He also told the Western Europeans, he said, you guys are a mess, basically, not like that. He said, you're a mess, and you'll be a mess until you start venerating your own saints. The old saints of England and France and Germany and all over the place. And I don't think anybody listened to him, but
looking at the society today, I would say no.
Yeah. It's but I agree. That's
Cassandra, you mentioned Metropolitan Bloom, and in his book Beginning to Pray, I think maybe that's where you picked up on that, but he reflected on his experience as a young physician. And he said, he was trying to see all these patients, and he would get behind, and he just couldn't get caught up. He was trying to treat all these people, and then finally he realized that what he was doing is that he wasn't spending enough time listening to them and really hearing what they had to say. And that's why he wasn't getting effective as a doctor. And he said once he learned to listen without worrying about how long it's taken, then he said then he was able to see many more patients and be much more effective because he became a listener.
Became a real doctor. He also made some lovely remarks to the effect that if medicine fails to do that, then they have failed.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess it's time for Vespers, I suppose. So I want to thank you guys for showing up. You had something to do. I'm sure you had something to do.
I'm sorry I couldn't make the wedding.
She was a blushing bride. She was lovely.
Right. Jessie is so happy now that she's legitimate. I hope it wasn't on tape. Edit that out.
Yeah.